For decades, South Korea lived under a simple assumption. If the worst ever happened, the United States would be there. But assumptions age, and in today's world, they decay faster than ever. Imagine this moment. North Korea can credibly strike American cities. Seoul asks a quiet, terrifying question. Would Washington really trade New York for Seoul? This is where the debate changes shape. Not about building the bomb, but about how close you stand to the edge. Nuclear latency is not a weapon. It is capability without commitment, power without the final step. And paradoxically, it may be the most stabilizing option left. Washington faces an uncomfortable truth. Stopping South Korea completely may no longer be possible. But managing how close it gets might still be. If this question matters to you about alliances, deterrence, and the future of global order, stay with me. Because to understand why nuclear latency emerged, we must first understand what broke beneath it. At the center of this debate is not technology. It is trust. For decades, US extended deterrence worked because belief filled the gaps that capability could not. South Korea believed that American power and American will were inseparable. That belief is now under strain. The problem is structural. As North Korea approaches a reliable ability to strike the US homeland, the cost calculus changes. Deterrence becomes symmetrical. Risk becomes mutual. And suddenly, Seoul's security depends not only on American capability, but on American willingness to absorb catastrophic loss. Washington has tried to respond. The Washington Declaration, the Nuclear Consultative Group, reassurances, procedures, symbolism. Yet public opinion in South Korea tells a different story. Support for an independent nuclear option has not faded. It has hardened. This is not emotional nationalism. It is strategic anxiety, a fear that decision-making will always sit thousands of miles away, constrained by US, domestic politics and global priorities. When reassurance fails to restore confidence, states begin to hedge. And once hedging begins, the question is no longer whether the old system works, but what replaces it. To understand how we arrived here, we need to step back and look at the cycle that has repeated itself before. Extended deterrence is strongest when threats are asymmetric. During the Cold War, US allies trusted Washington because adversaries could not easily strike the American homeland. The risk was uneven. The guarantee felt solid. That condition no longer holds on the Korean peninsula. North Korea's steady progress toward long-range nuclear capabilities has altered the geometry of deterrence. What was once a regional problem is now a homeland problem for the United States. And when deterrence becomes reciprocal, reassurance loses force. South Korea has lived through this shift gradually. Each North Korean missile test, each new warhead estimate, each reminder that response timelines are shrinking from hours to minutes. Over time, confidence erodes not because the alliance weakens, but because the strategic environment hardens. History shows that when allies doubt protection, they seek options that stop short of rupture, not abandonment, not defiance, but insurance. Nuclear latency emerges precisely in these moments. It is not a rejection of alliances. It is a symptom of their stress. And once that stress crosses a threshold, events stop unfolding quietly. They accelerate. Then came the moment when ambiguity turned into momentum. Last October, President Donald Trump announced that the United States had given South Korea approval to build nuclear-powered submarines. On the surface, this looked technical, naval, almost mundane. But beneath it sat something far more consequential. Because nuclear-powered submarines are not just platforms, they are fuel. They are enrichment. They are time. Under existing agreements, South Korea is tightly constrained. It can enrich uranium only to limited levels and only with US consent. Military use is explicitly prohibited. Yet just weeks after the announcement, a White House fact sheet outlined a different path supporting South Korea's development of enrichment and reprocessing technologies for peaceful uses without needing Congress. Legally clean, politically subtle, strategically explosive. This was not a bomb decision. It was a latency decision. If you care about how power actually shifts, not with headlines, but with quiet permissions, this is where you should pay attention. Because once the door to capability opens, it rarely closes. And the most important mechanisms are still hidden from view. Here is the mechanism most people miss. Nuclear latency is not about intention. It is about compression. The hardest part of building a nuclear weapon is not design. It is material, fissile material. Enrichment and reprocessing collapse timelines. They transform nuclear weapons from a decade-long national project into a months-long political decision. Once that capability exists, the barrier is no longer technical, it is psychological and diplomatic. This is why the non-proliferation system fears latency more than rhetoric. A country does not need to announce anything. It only needs to be ready. Washington has historically tried to prevent exactly this. U.S. nuclear cooperation agreements restrict enrichment and reprocessing because once those skills diffuse, control disappears, norms weaken, others demand equal treatment. And that is the risk. If South Korea moves closer to the threshold, Saudi Arabia and Turkey will watch carefully, not for permission, but for precedent. The accusation of double standards would be immediate and difficult to rebut. Yet here is the paradox. Trying to freeze South Korea in place may accelerate the very outcome Washington fears. The more insecurity rises, the more attractive a rapid breakout becomes. Latency is dangerous, but denying it entirely may be worse, because systems under pressure do not remain static. They rupture. The second crisis is quieter but far more dangerous. It begins with a simple realization in Seoul. Every alternative has a ceiling. Extended deterrence reassures but never resolves doubt. Tactical nuclear redeployment looks bold but changes little. Control stays in Washington. Vulnerability increases at home. Redeploying U.S. nuclear weapons would place South Korea in the crosshairs without giving it the keys. In a conflict where decisions may need to be made in minutes, not hours, dependence becomes liability. Seoul would still wait, still hope, still trust that someone else presses the button in time, and Washington knows this. That is why shared launch authority is a line the United States will not cross, not legally, not politically, not strategically. The result is a dangerous imbalance, more risk, no autonomy. At the same time, the costs to the United States rise. Storage, logistics, legal exposure under the Non-Proliferation Treaty. All pain, little gain. This is the moment when policy runs out of clean options. When leaders are forced to choose, not between good and bad, but between bad and worse. And that is when latent power starts to look like restraint. Now shift your perspective from strategy to skin. Imagine you are a citizen in Seoul. You wake up every day within range of artillery, missiles, and nuclear threats. You watch North Korea test weapons. You watch great powers debate language. And you are told to trust that someone else will decide fast enough. Trust that someone else will risk their cities for yours. Trust that history will repeat itself kindly. This is not paranoia. It is proximity. For you, nuclear latency is not escalation. It is reassurance. Not because you want a bomb, but because you want certainty. The knowledge that if everything fails, you are not defenseless. This is why public support matters. Not as polling data, but as lived experience. When fear becomes persistent, it reshapes political reality. It narrows tolerance for ambiguity. If you feel this tension between dependence and dignity, you understand why latency resonates so deeply. And if this analysis helps you see the world more clearly, pause for a moment, share it, talk about it. These conversations shape what comes next. Because what happens to one society under pressure rarely stays there. What happens in Seoul never stays in Seoul. Nuclear latency would ripple outward quietly but decisively across the Indo-Pacific. North Korea would be forced to recalculate. Limited attacks, gray zone provocations, even tactical nuclear use would suddenly carry a higher risk. Not because South Korea has nuclear weapons, but because it could have them fast. China would notice as well. A more self-assured South Korea alters regional balance. It becomes less dependent, more confident, harder to coerce. That complicates Beijing's strategic planning, especially at sea, where nuclear-powered submarines extend reach far beyond the peninsula. For Washington, this shift cuts both ways. On one hand, it strengthens deterrence and burden sharing. On the other, it challenges long-standing non-proliferation norms that underpin U.S. global leadership. Beyond Asia, the signal would travel further. Other states would study the model, control latency, alliance tolerance, conditional permission. The precedent would matter as much as the capability. This is how global order changes now, not with explosions, but with allowances. And once allowances are made, the future stops being theoretical. It becomes a choice. So where does this path lead? There are three futures and none are clean. The first is the best-case scenario. South Korea develops nuclear latency under strict safeguards. Transparency is maintained. Breakout remains politically costly. Deterrence stabilizes, not because weapons are built, but because uncertainty restrains aggression. Washington preserves the alliance. The non-proliferation regime bends, but does not break. The second is the middle path. Latency spreads, quietly, selectively. Other states demand similar treatment. Norms erode unevenly. The system survives, but with cracks. Nuclear risk rises not dramatically, but persistently. Management replaces prevention. Then there is the worst-case future. Trust collapses. A crisis hits before safeguards can hold. Latency turns into acceleration. South Korea crosses the threshold, others follow. The credibility of the non-proliferation regime collapses not from defiance, but from precedent. What was once exceptional becomes normal. The difference between these futures is not technology. It is governance, oversight, timing, political restraint. Latency does not decide outcomes. How it is managed does. And that brings us to the final question. Washington must face not about capability, but about choice. Because in the end, refusing to choose is still a decision. Here is the uncomfortable conclusion. There is no perfect answer, only tolerable ones. Preventing South Korea from moving closer to the nuclear threshold may feel principled, but it risks pushing Seoul toward the very outcome Washington fears most: an independent arsenal built quickly, under pressure, and without consent. Accepting nuclear latency is not endorsement. It is management. It buys time. It preserves alliance cohesion. It strengthens deterrence without crossing the line that would shatter the global non-proliferation regime overnight. Most importantly, it acknowledges reality. That credibility cannot be commanded. It must be felt. And today, extended deterrence alone no longer delivers that feeling. In a world of eroding trust and rising symmetry, power is no longer binary. It exists on gradients. Nuclear latency sits on that gradient. Dangerous, yes, but also stabilizing if handled with discipline. The least bad option is rarely inspiring, but it is often the one that prevents catastrophe. If you want to understand how global order is changing not through wars, but through quiet recalibration, stay with this conversation. Share it, question it, push it further. Because the future of deterrence will not be decided in one dramatic moment. It will be decided by choices like this.